True endings. Games can have multiple choice, multiple outcomes, but there are many games designed with one outcome being the canonical one or the correct one. But it ends up being something more a bit divisive on execution, because sometimes the canonical outcome may not be the most interesting one, or the requirements for the outcome may be too ridiculous for some and not worth the effort. Let me start with a unique case, that being Alan Wake 2. Because when Alan Wake 2 came out, there was no actual true ending of sorts, there was just the one ending and that's it, and the ending was designed to be unsatisfying to a certain degree. It wasn't until later where they updated the game to include the mode called the Final Draft, in which case now you're able to get the full conclusion to the narrative along with some extra bits of narrative that are sprinkled in the game, but not a whole lot. The issue with this is the fact that 1, this was a patch delivered down the road and not part of the game, and 2, required the player to beat the game again, which, if you're just blitzing through the game, can be done pretty fast, but asking the player to repeat the entire game again with no actual gameplay changes and minimal new story explanations is asking a lot of the player, especially once again, like I said, you're asking them ideally if they bought it at launch, they would have to have done it like a month or 2 later when they actually released the Final Draft. And I've seen people never go back for it because they're already unsatisfied with the conclusion of the base game, so why would they play it again for it to maybe be better? I know people try to make explanations for why the concept of playing the game again for Final Draft is actually narrative genius. Nah, especially since not much changes at all, and gameplay wise the same thing. It's not the player uncovering something or doing something in order to actually break a cycle. It's just playing the game again with no actual gameplay changes. Valkyrie Profile is a game that I think is fantastic and very enjoyable, and when it comes to the multiple endings, they do a good job at letting the player know that there is still more to what's going on, and it also helps that Valkyrie Profile isn't too long of a game to replay. The issue is, as good of a job the game does at letting you know there is still more going on to pursue it, the problem is what you're required to do, because the tasks they want you to do become way too specific and must be done by a certain deadline that you are not aware of, whether it be going to certain dungeons that you don't know are required in order to do it, or doing stuff like lowering Valkyrie's seal value by certain points, or recruiting certain Anhariar at certain points, and then sending them to Valhalla at certain points, and stuff like that. It becomes way too specific to the point where the player pretty much needs a guide in order to even know how to get it, because I can't honestly imagine someone doing that without a guide. On top of the fact that if you're playing on the easiest difficulty, you cannot obtain this ending because certain dungeons are unavailable on the easiest mode, meaning you cannot obtain the best ending on the easy mode as well, so you must be on normal or higher. Ironically, I recommend hard mode because it gives you all the locations possible, on top of the fact that with certain tricks in the game, it's not actually that difficult to beat the game. But it's just one of those things where the actual task becomes so ridiculous and specific that trying to have someone do it normally becomes a, how is someone supposed to figure all this out? A true ending path that I honestly don't necessarily complaints for is the ones for the Dead Rising series, specifically Dead Rising 1, 2, and 3, where it's just pursue the case files. That is pretty much what you have to do. For some reason, people seem to see that as way too difficult when it's just complete the main plot. Yes, everything in the game is on a time limit, but the time limit is generous to the point, it's designed for you to be able to do that and gives you time to do side quests. It's only a struggle if you're doing Dead Rising 3's Nightmare mode, where the game's time system is unbalanced. On normal mode, you have too much time. On Nightmare mode, you have too few time to do side quests, so that's always actually an issue. But just playing normally, you're gonna do perfectly fine. The rest of people complain about that one. The issue becomes is Dead Rising 2's true ending, where ending S was the game's canonical conclusion until they released Case West, which retconned it to be that ending A is the canonical conclusion. So the entire epilogue segment of Dead Rising 2 Overtime mode never actually happens, and it follows up after ending A, which, if you were to play Dead Rising 2 normally, not know about Case West, ending A is not a satisfying ending at all. Also a bit goofy in a way. So that would be a conclusion is such a weird choice, but it is one that does allow them to continue onward, even if I do have some questions on the logic of how Case West starts concerning that ending, but it's one of those things that pretty much with the power of making a new entry, they retcon what the ending actually was. A similar case is the Infamous series. How Infamous didn't really have a canonical conclusion until they had to make sequels, so developers had to pick what was the outcome of the game. With Infamous 1 actually not really having canonical outcomes, and Infamous 2 can start from either or. It's when Second Son walks to the picture where they had to just choose which of the two endings were canonical, and the hero option was made canonical, even if it made the less sense to pick that one, but put it by trophy data. I already read about that, I'm not gonna write about it again. But it's one of those things where a game can be designed to just give a player choice in that manner, and then have to decide later down the road if they want to continue the series or continue this specific storyline. They have to then choose what the canonical outcome is. By the time of this video, Second Son not having a canonical outcome, so there's no follow-up, so the game can still be decided whether or not you are good Delsin or evil Delsin. It is fine either or, since there is no follow-up to use, so either pathway still works. It's one of those things where Infamous 2 had to pick a canonical outcome after the fact. A very interesting phenomenon I've noticed for the years is when games don't have a canonical conclusion, but there are people who will try to claim one pathway is more correct than the other, regardless of that fact. Easy examples to like, let's say, Shin Megami Tensei Nocturne or SMT3, which mainland SMT in general just doesn't have a canon ending at all. Like, sure, SMT2, people want to argue which ending is canon because there's callbacks to SMT1, but doesn't necessarily say that one of the endings was canon per se. It just means certain events happen in between the games, you know. But it's one of those things where there is no canon ending, but instead, people will use the pathway that has the most content as what they deem as canonical, believing that the most content, the most stuff in it, the most play value you get has to be the correct one, because it gives you more going on. It gives you more lore and more stuff, even though in reality, there is no canon ending. Like SMT3, you'll see people saying, oh, true demon ending, which is even its name, is canonical pathway. It is not. That was a pathway added in a re-release, which for people outside Japan was the default release of the game. But because it has the most content, the most boss fights, the most lore and stuff like that, people think it is actually the canonical ending, when it's not. There is no canon pathway. Same thing with Shin Megami Tensei 4. The neutral route has the most content, has the most lore put into it, has the most stuff going on. It is the most difficult one to get because of how the alignment system works, but it is not a canonical ending because there is no actual canonical end to SMT4. Shin Megami Tensei 5 actually had a hidden ending that requires certain things in order to be done in order to unlock it, and people see that as canonical ending, and once again, no, there is a canonical ending. It's just based on whichever one you prefer. Once again, by the logic of this has the most lore, there's the most stuff going on, this also has stuff that makes no sense in it and kind of doesn't work, but most effort, most content, people see that has to be the canonical conclusion to the game. Then you also have cases like Clair Obscure X-Ray 33, which does have two endings depending on one choice the player makes, with the developer Self Interactive claiming that either choice isn't incorrect, and that there is no quote-unquote good or bad outcome, and there is no true canonical outcome. It is based on players' preference. That doesn't stop people from arguing back and forth on which one's quote-unquote the correct one. Not help that in this instance, Sevenfold having the idea of there is no correct option is admirable, but if you look at the actual contents of the endings they put, it makes that statement more of a I am questioning you, the developers, and your mindset moralities when it comes to these endings. But either way, that's what they decided to roll with. That's what they rolled with. There is no true outcome, but people try to argue why the choice they made is the correct one and that there is no alternative. Even though, again, like I said, just enjoy what you like. One case I'll put of a true ending not being worth it and being less interested in a different ending is Luminous Adventure X2, where in that game, the game has multiple endings. A normal ending, a bad ending, and a true ending. The reason I have a complaint is because the true ending requires the effort of not only unlocking the game's hard mode, which requires fighting 4 tokens in the game, but also requires doing hard mode, which strips the player of all their abilities, changes the boss's weaknesses, that was actually pretty cool, and requires you to beat the final boss all on 1 life bar. And they also took away, initially when the game first came out, took away the ability for Copa to heal himself. So you effectively had nothing to really use on your side because you couldn't get upgrades anymore, and were just base coping and you had a lives counter, which meant you now have game overs and can't infinitely retry. So that made the objective of doing the true ending completely painful, and then the actual outcome you get for the true ending was the most nothing ending, to the point where, me included, many will say, nothing basically happened in that game if you go based on the true ending. Many prefer the bad ending because although it is a bad outcome and something bad has happened, something actually happened at least, and it's more interesting than nothing the game's true ending actually gives you, and requires way less effort to actually achieve than the game's true ending. Like I said, nowadays, you have an easier time getting a true ending, because now you can heal yourself. Like, start with 99 lives, that still ain't enough. And they're re-releasing the Luminous Adventure X games, including fixes and updates to the game that should have just been a patch, not an entire re-release sold separately. But NT Creates sucks, so what does that matter? Either way, the point is, the true ending just flat out was not worth the effort. Now, a double-edged sword when it comes to true endings is the Hunter aspect, where there are people who refuse to get any other ending or do any other choice in the game outside of the true ending because they feel like everything else is now no longer interesting or basically invalid. Which many people feel like if a game has a canonical ending, that means that every other ending that now becomes a interesting what-if scenario is now rendered pointless to them, so they don't get the true conclusion on the first playthrough. Then they feel like they basically wasted their time playing the entire game. 2 cases I've seen complain about was Persona 5 Royal, and only the Royal version for some reason, and Persona 4, both versions. More in the case of Persona 4, it's the fact that people missed the true ending, and rather than accepting they screwed up, they instead blame the game for it, acting as if it was very cryptic about it when it was very upfront as early as the beginning of the game that there was more going on to the mystery. Made an entire video about that. You can go see why I think that ending is actually great, and people's complaints are literally them getting mad at themselves blaming the game. While the Royal one, I don't understand the complaints with 1, the game telling you up front what you need to do, and 2, You're not missing out on the true ending in Royal, you're missing out on an epilogue. Because that epilogue has jack all to do with the rest of the game, has its own narrative arc, and then minimally actually affects the ending of the game. So that's not exactly an ending, that's just an additional epilogue you can miss. But people still count it as complain that if they missed that content, then their playthrough might as well not have happened, even though the game still features the original game's ending and everything, which is the actual true end of the game. But, just again, people feel like if I miss content, that means I did something wrong and didn't get the actual outcome, even though in this case, it was an epilogue. One thing that also gets complaints is also when it comes to the case of Asura's Wrath. Because that game had a quote-unquote true ending DLC, people complain that the ending of that game was made into DLC. In reality, the developers wanted to make a sequel, but they didn't get the green light for a sequel and had the green light for DLC, so they decided to essentially jam their sequel idea into that DLC, which is why the main game does wrap up stuff, but it's sequel baits, and then the DLC had to essentially introduce and then complete an entire sequel arc in that DLC. From what I've seen, people do enjoy the DLC and think it's great, but the fact that it's called like the true ending DLC made it so it was a PR disaster entirely. You know, the situation of it makes people go, oh, and actually understand where developers were coming from when it came to that DLC's creation. Last thing I'll mention, it's just 3 cases of a true ending requirement vastly changing when it has kind of the same mentality. Typically, for example, No More Heroes 1. Just get the last beam katana. That's it. Don't gotta fully upgrade it, just get the last beam katana, and the true ending is yours. Simple thing of just get all the beam katana. Simple mentality. Ape escape, get all the monkeys. That's it. You capture all the monkeys, and you get the finale in the game's true ending. Simple idea. Final Fantasy X-2. Do everything in the game, you get the game's perfect / true ending. I say more perfect because remember epilogue than actual ending, so you get the game's epilogue. But the idea of do everything, notice how for No More Heroes, it was just get all beam katanas, ape escape, get all the monkeys. So there's like over 200 of them, but still a simple task, get all the monkeys. Final Fantasy X-2 is one of the most infamous cases of unlocking an epilogue / ending, because doing everything means your save file must be 100%. And there are people who made entire complicated charts highlighting how ridiculous that is. From doing every task, talking to every NPC, talking to NPCs when their dialogue box updates after story events, letting NPCs' dialogue box leave the screen naturally instead of leaving the screen beforehand. It gets so ridiculous, even under the same simple principle of just do all the stuff and you get the ending, but they want you to do literally all of the stuff in the game. And you can see how a simple idea ends up getting pushed to ridiculous levels when it's the same concept across these 3 different examples of games. I just want to ramble about the topic of true endings and just how it can change someone's view of a game, more so its narrative, because of its inclusion. With some hating the inclusion because it makes them feel like any other ending they prefer or choice they have is invalid because of it. Some feel like they should only exist under the pretense that there is or will be a follow-up title, otherwise they feel like a true ending doesn't need to exist. And there are people who just make it to where the only thing they care about in the game is the canonical outcome, so anything else is seen as pointless stuff to include, even if it does make for cool what-if scenarios and fun stuff for replay values. And in some situations where a true ending can be a bit asking too much of the player, making things too difficult for not much payoff, or in some cases, just flat out not even actually the canonical outcome due to later retcons and everything. One last example I'll mention is Summer Summer 2 Record Breaker, which has an epilogue, but the premise of the epilogue is based on an ending that is not actually available to the player. And that game does have a hidden ending. Once again, there is no canon ending to Dark Souls 2's main game until this epilogue created its own ending in order to explain this epilogue. So it's another case where every ending in the main game by proxy now is something that technically couldn't have happened because of the scenario, but details. Alright then, gotta say, go out there, play games, get the true ending, or don't, because sometimes you may not agree with the true ending for a variety of reasons. So that's the topic. Alrighty then, good day.